Efficiency. That was a dumb joke. The hallmark of an engineer that knows Factorio's systems inside and out. But what happens when Factorio's mechanics are fundamentally altered? What happens when all of the recipes in the game change? What happens when every single item becomes fish? In today's video, we'll be playing through Fish Mode Remix, a mod that replaces one ingredient in nearly every recipe with some amount of fish. Let's get started. The first thing I noticed after spawning in were these strange machines called transmutation devices. Hold on, what is this thing? Whoa, okay. Pretty sure this machine will be used to make fish somehow, but I'll worry about the specifics later. These new devices aren't the only thing different about the world though. It also appears that the ore patches have been severely diminished. To make up for this though, you can craft ores directly by smelting fish. After clearing up the shipwreck and collecting a few fish from a nearby pond to jumpstart crafting, I set up some burner drills and furnaces on these small patches. Hopefully I wouldn't have to resort to crafting the ores directly for at least a little bit. Steam power was next, but I'd already run out of fish and needed more to craft the boilers and engines. Now is the time to figure out these transmutation devices. The basic mechanics of the machines seemed pretty straightforward. Items go in, fish come out. These were going to be fun to tinker with. A few minutes of crafting, transmuting, and pest control later, and I had basic steam power and a lab. The transmutation devices gave off quite a bit of pollution, so turrets and walls were up first on the tech tree, followed quickly by much-needed machine guns. With basic defenses in place, some simple automation was up next. At this point though, the complexities of the mod's changes began to show themselves. With the new disassembly recipes, there were now multiple methods of crafting nearly every item. After combing through what I'd already unlocked, I found it was actually more materially efficient to create iron plates by deconstructing green circuits and gears by disassembling yellow belts. I also discovered there was actually a very small loop in the system, as the amount of fish needed to create yellow belts was just slightly less than the number of fish generated when transmuting them. Using these recipes, I set up a simple looping factory to produce automation science. Cool. Before we continue though, as I unlock more recipes, disassemblies, and fish transmutations, it'd be nice to know which ones are the most resource friendly. Let's start taking notes to track the cost of things moving forward. I'm sure this simple notepad will be sufficient for everything down the line. After working through the numbers and notes from everything I'd unlocked up to that point, I discovered a super cool infinite loop that would allow me to generate unlimited fish, belts, and iron. Now, before we move on to start making designs and finding other loops, let me explain how these loops work. To start, we need to know the cost of all relevant items. So, for this example, in units of fish, iron plates cost a total of 2 each, belts cost 1.5, and undergrounds cost 15. In this case, disassembling undergrounds gives back 10 iron plates. 10 iron plates times 2 fish per plate gives us a total of 20 fish worth of iron plates, even though an underground only costs 15 fish to make. And so, with the excess belts and undergrounds that'll build up going into a transmuter, we now have an infinite loop. Man, that is satisfying. Now that this loop is running on its own, let's add to it so we can make automation science more efficiently than before. We'll craft iron into pistols, pistols into copper, and copper into science. Awesome. Hopping into the lab, I decided to split up different parts of this loop into a couple of blueprints. That way we can access the different materials in the loop more easily in the future. One designed for iron production using fish, one for copper creation from iron, and another for fish production using belts, which, at the moment, have the best fish in to fish out ratio, or, as I like to call it, FIFO. What do you mean the acronym's already taken? The frick is a data structure? Oh, like the thing on Spotify? These blueprints would become staples for a good portion of the run. Let's set these up in the real world. Nice. Thinking ahead, we're probably going to need another transmutation device at some point, but it takes a walloping 65,000 fish? I'll set up a simple overflow splitter for now to slowly start working on that. With plenty of iron going around, I made some ammo and took out a couple of nearby nests. After that bug-filled excursion, next up was steel. At the moment, the best recipe for steel is the deconstruction of heavy armor, and the amount of steel that each piece of armor produced meant we'd only need a single assembler working on this for a while. Finally, with basic resources and materials figured out, let's work on a basic spaghetti mold for the essentials we'll need. At this point, I was feeling fairly confident about our setup and couldn't do much else without research. Let's finally get logistics science up and running. Then more fish, more guns, more items, and more notes. Yikes, this list is starting to get kind of intense. Maybe I should switch to something... Oh, nice. Uh-oh. Looks like the coal patch is running out. I'll have to start using grenade disassembly to fuel the steam engines. Surely this will be enough. With science and steam solved, I sought to surpass this starter spaghetti setup to something suitably structured and sophisticated. For this run, I wanted to try an all-train base, so I spent a couple hours working on some blueprints with some updated, more efficient recipes. While I was in the lab, though, the biters decided to sneak up on the base, and I had forgotten to refill the turret's ammo. I'll set up a couple of simple ammo belts, so this won't be a problem again. More guns, more repairs, and even more notes. Before we get this train system up and running, let's set up chemical science. I'm definitely not setting up all of those annoying rail signals by hand, so we'll need bots. The recipe chain here is definitely interesting. Pumps into engines, modular armor into red chips, and fish into sulfur. Speaking of fish, more fish! There we go. A small trickle of chemical science. There we go. Construction bots. Now that the research is done, I can finally build a building that builds bots that build buildings. Let's set up a quick mall for the bots before we start laying down train blueprints. Finally, with everything ready for construction, let's get started with these train blocks. While the bots are working on that, I'll go through the base and perform some long overdue upgrades. Better belts, better assemblers, Papa John's. Also, manually filling these ammo chests is starting to become a chore, and it's definitely time to upgrade to piercing rounds. I'll set up a mini factory for that. Oh shoot, power's out. Looks like the new roboports overloaded the steam engines and coal production. And since we don't have any power, we're not producing any ammo and the bugs are getting in. Ugh, definitely don't want a repeat of last run. Let's fix that right away. Looks like grenade disassembly and smelting fish directly into coal just isn't cutting it. I'll have to disconnect the roboports and manually craft a bunch of solar panels to jumpstart the system again. There we go. Now that steam is back up and running though, I don't want to deal with a blackout like that again. Let's go ahead and upgrade to nuclear power just to handle the upcoming roboports. After a quick expansion of the spaghetti mall for nuclear stuff and some uranium creation and processing, there's nuclear. With that figured out, let's reconnect the power to the outer roboports. Then we can finish construction on the first few train blocks and connect the ammo belts all the way around the base. Next, an upgrade for science production. Now that everything seems to be running well and there are no crises, I'll kick off the train system with some starter materials. Watching this train-based loop get off the ground, though, I discovered something.
Uh-oh. I've been doing some recipes wrong. This may not be as efficient of a factory as it should be.
Indeed. After unlocking so many recipes and taking so many notes, things were starting to get a little too complicated and difficult to follow. Something had to be done. I needed a better way of keeping track of things. Something faster. Something smarter. Something more spreadsheety. I spent hours and hours working tirelessly on a solution, learning the strange jumbled art of JavaScript, delving into the dark magic of VLOOKUPs, and communing with the AI overlords. After many days toiling away, I had created something so powerful, so beautiful, so incredible.
Dude, we get it! Stop the mythic foraging montage and tell us what it is for Pete's sake.
Right, sorry. I made a spreadsheet. This sheet, using some custom app script, not only helps you keep track of new recipes, disassemblies, and transmutations you unlock, but also calculates the most efficient way of crafting each item. Now, if you don't want to listen to me blabber on about the specifics of how the sheet works, go ahead and skip to this part of the video. Otherwise, here's how it works. First, when you unlock a new recipe, you'll have to enter a bit of info. In the direct sheet, you'll put in the name, how many of that item the recipe creates, how many fish you get from it when transmuting, and all the different ingredients, names, and amounts, right here. The costs are calculated for you automatically, and are based on how many fish it would take to craft the item if you went directly from fish to ore, and then all the way up the chain. Then, in the disassembly sheet, you'll make an entry for the items you get back when deconstructing the item. Fairly simple so far, but this is where the fun begins. The dashboard sheet is where this document really shines. For each item, you can find the cost of the item when using its most efficient recipe, how many fish you get out per fish put in when transmuting, and, the best part of this entire project, the recipe chain. This recipe chain tells you exactly how to craft the item in the most efficient way. Whenever you enter in data for a newly unlocked recipe, you can go ahead and hit this Run Script button to recalculate all of these values. But Stochastis, how do the calculations work? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me break it down for you. To start, the script reads and collects all the data from the direct and disassembly sheets. Then our main loop begins. Step 1. For each disassembly recipe, we calculate how much it costs to make the item being disassembled. Then, we split that cost among the number of items being created and see if this new cost is cheaper than the currently recorded cost of the item. If it is, we log it as the new, cheapest way to make the item. Step 2. For each crafting recipe, since some of the recipe's ingredients prices may have changed from the previous step, we recalculate its cost to craft. Step 3. As long as there was at least one cost update in one of the two previous steps, we repeat the loop. Otherwise, we exit and move on to step 4, which is recipe chains. These chains, although super cool to look at and very useful, are actually fairly simple to make. Once we've collected all of the data from the loop, we know the cheapest cost to craft something, and if a disassembly recipe can make it, the cheapest disassembly too. For each item, we check if it's cheaper to craft it or to disassemble it from something else. We mark which is cheaper and then move on to the ingredients for that item and repeat the process, concatenating everything as we go. So, after the costs and recipe chains are ready, we move on to step 5 and just populate the dashboard sheet with the final results. Ta-da! That's how it all works. Now, with the comfort of knowing what the best recipes are, it's time for some upgrades. First, instead of our current way of generating fish, which only has a FIFO rate of 1.8 for yellow belts, let's switch to copper cables, which have a rate of 17? Holy crap! I guess heat exchangers make copper really cheap. Anyways, after making a couple more designs for new train blocks, it was time to clear out the space for them. But to do that, I wanted to try out personal laser defenses since I had never really used them before. So I made an entirely logistics bot-based mall to make a bunch of random unrelated stuff. Wow, that transition didn't make any sense. It's called getting sidetracked, and it happens a lot in Factorio. Anyways, moving on. So, with my power armor created and personal lasers equipped, I died. And then I died. And then I died again. I have decided I don't like laser defenses. I tried a couple other things like tanks and defender capsules, but as per usual, the best method of clearing nests before artillery remains to be turret creeping. More bots, more guns, and more logistics shenanigans that are definitely only a temporary measure and will definitely be gotten rid of after trains are fully up and running. Speaking of trains, let's stamp down some blueprints with new and improved recipes, like disassembling copper from heat exchangers, transmuting cable into fish, and disassembling iron from turrets. I'd made sure that these factories would be enough to supply each other once they were fully up and running, but I still had to wait for the system to fill the initial backlog of items needed. Now, the smart thing to do would have been just to wire up some temporary material production to these stations from the main base to help kickstart the whole process, but watching the train system slowly boot up over the course of 15 or so hours is just so much more fun. Geez, that took too long. Let's move on. If I want to actually get off this planet, I'll need more research than what the base is currently producing. So, let's get a big train-powered lab set up along with automation, logistic, military, and chemical science. You might be thinking that most of these science factories seem quite small for a big train base, and you'd be right. The reason for this factory minification is because at this point I realized that a big train base was not a good idea. After spending so long working on getting the train system booted up, it finally got through my thick skull that although a fully train-based system isn't bad in and of itself, the way I was using it definitely was. I'm not sure why I didn't think of this earlier, but the blocks and trains should have been much smaller, probably only a couple cars each, and the storage chests should not have had all of their space available to fill. I guess I could have continued this trend of waiting around forever for things to slowly get filled up, working towards a fully functional big train base, but I was about ready to finish this run and move on, so I decided to make the factory smaller, requiring less resources, limit chest buffer sizes, and reduce how long trains sat at stations so they weren't waiting around until their cargo was completely full. Definitely should have done that 20 hours or so ago, but oh well. Anyways, utility science, done. And there's artillery too. Fun. With artillery cannons allowing me to easily expand the base, there's production science. And rocket silo. Finally! I think for the final stretch, I wanted to switch up the base design. I was kind of fed up with trains at this point, and I had already done some spaghetti in the beginning, so let's just continue with the logistics shenanigans from earlier that I said were definitely only a temporary measure. But Now we have a rocket silo built. Thankfully, the rocket parts were built at a fairly reasonable pace, only needing to wait for the bots to deliver fish, which, again, if I was thinking properly, I could have just routed from the main base, but remember, thick skull. But despite my annoyingly dense cranium, we finally made it off the planet, and launched into the Space Age! Coming soon to a channel near you. Now for my totally original and not at all stolen from Doshington retrospective bit. Overall, this mod was actually pretty interesting. Even though I spent 3 days working on a spreadsheet for it, I actually enjoyed the logistical twists that it brought to the game. I especially enjoyed the infinite loops you had to find and exploit to make up for the lack of mineable resources. And the mod has randomized seeds you can use if you want to retry the challenge with different recipes and ratios. Super cool. Now, this challenge did take me around 72 hours to complete in total, but that was totally my fault. For the train system, coming up with original blueprints instead of finding pre-existing ones, trying to get the system to boot up on its own, and making everything far too large absolutely cost me at least 20 or 25 hours. Not to mention the boredom that came along with it bogging me down and probably costing me another 10 hours just from the lack of motivation. Putting my own mistakes aside though, this is a super cool mod and I'd be stoked to try it again if they ever port it over to Space Age. Anyways, that's all for today's video. Thank you all for watching and we'll see y'all next time.